galaxy had moved on. That was the simplest way to say it. The stars still burned, the trade routes still hummed with ships, and the great galactic conclave still met every 100 years to argue about borders and resources and old wars that most species had already forgotten. Life continued, as it always does, filling the empty spaces left behind by those who were gone. Humanity was gone. No one said it with sadness anymore. It had been 20,000 years. 20,000 years since the last confirmed human signal had come through. A broken, half-dead distress beacon, crackling with static, swallowed by the void rift near the far edge of the Orion Arm. 20,000 years since any ship, any probe, any single transmission had come out of the regions once called human space. The Conclave had waited, as was the custom. They had sent search missions in the early centuries. They had found nothing. No survivors, no wreckage, no answers. Eventually, they stopped looking. The 12 spacefaring civilizations that now called themselves the Galactic Conclave had slowly, quietly moved into the spaces humanity had left behind. Some built stations there. Some mined the old asteroid belts. Some turned the empty colony worlds into historical sites where young ones of their species could walk through the ruins of old human cities and stare at the strange flat screens and metal frames and try to imagine what kind of creatures had once lived inside them. Children across the galaxy grew up learning about humans the way humans had once learned about their own ancient extinct animals. They were interesting. They were impressive in their time. They had been fierce and creative and surprisingly difficult to kill, right up until the moment they simply weren't there anymore. The Tharan were among the most respected of the conclave species. Tall, quiet beings with 4 arms and skin like pale stone, known for their patience and their obsession with record-keeping. Their sensor web stretched across a quarter of the galaxy, a network of listening stations so sensitive they could detect a single ship's engine firing from 3 star systems away. It was this web that first noticed something wrong. Senior archivist Vel Soth had been at her post for 400 years. She had seen strange things before. Rogue comets with unusual radiation signatures, dead stars collapsing in unexpected ways. Once, memorably, a derelict cargo ship from the old Maroc Wars that had been drifting in circles for 6 centuries before anyone noticed. She was not easily surprised. The reading on her screen surprised her. It was a ship. That much was clear. The sensor web could make out its basic shape, massive, far larger than anything the Conclave currently operated. A dreadnought, by old classification, though that word had not been used in active military records for longer than most civilizations had existed. Its hull gave off a heat signature that was strange and uneven, as if large sections of it had been repaired many times over, with materials that did not quite match the original. Which made sense, Velsap supposed, for something that old. It was the transponder code that stopped her cold. She ran it through the Conclave's decryption system, and the system simply sat there, thinking, for 3 full days. It had never seen a code that old. It had to dig through layer after layer of archived dead languages just to find the base structure. When the translation finally came through, Velsoth read it 3 times before she believed it. The ship was human. Not a replica. Not a piece of salvage. Not some other species that had found human wreckage and repurposed it. The code was original, undoctored, and it matched the registration format of a class of warship that had been commissioned over 20,000 years ago. The name on the registration was USCS Unbroken Meridian. The hull number matched a ship that had been reported lost in the Void Rift event. The same event that had swallowed the last human signals and started the long silence. Velsoth sat very still for a long time. Then she called the Conclave. The emergency session was called within hours, which was fast by Conclave standards. Usually it took weeks just to agree on a meeting time. But the words, confirmed human vessel in Velsot's report, had the effect of a fire alarm on every delegate who heard them. They came quickly, crowding into the great chamber on the conclave station, with expressions ranging from disbelief to open fear. The debates began immediately, as they always did. Some delegates argued it was a fake, some unknown species playing a very old trick with stolen codes. Others said it was a ghost ship, drifting dead, and that whatever was left inside would be nothing but bones and old data drives. A few of the younger delegates, who had grown up on stories of human ferocity, quietly suggested that perhaps the correct response was to simply destroy it before it got any closer to populated space. Velsath listened to all of it and said nothing for a long time. She had pulled every scan the sensor web could manage on the Meridian, and she had been studying the data for hours while the others argued. The ship was not dead. Its power output was steady and strong, stronger, in fact, than should have been possible for any engine design she recognized. It was not drifting. It was moving with clear, deliberate direction, aimed straight toward the galactic core. And there was something else. The hull. From a distance, the damage looked random, the kind of deep scarring that came from centuries of radiation and debris impact. But the closer scans told a different story. The marks on the hull were not random. They were carved. Long, precise, geometric patterns cut deep into the armor plating, covering entire sections of the ship's surface in designs that repeated and connected in ways that seemed almost mathematical. Not battle damage, not decoration, something intentional, made by someone with a great deal of time and a very specific purpose in mind. Velsath did not know what the patterns meant. But the thought that sat in her chest cold and heavy was this. Whatever had been out there in the dark with that ship for 20,000 years, the crew had apparently had enough time to develop an opinion about it. The conclave voted, eventually, to send a delegation to intercept the vessel. It was not a unanimous vote. Several species abstained. 2 voted against. But the majority carried as it usually did, and the mission was authorized. Velsath volunteered to lead it herself. No one argued with her. As the delegation ship broke away from the station and set course for the Kerith Nebula, where the Meridian was projected to pass within intercept range, Velsath stood at the observation deck and watched the stars slide past. She had spent 400 years cataloging the known and the understood. She was good at it. She was comfortable with it. She had the quiet, certain feeling that her comfortable years were over. The Meridian was even larger up close. Velsath had reviewed the scans so many times that she thought she was prepared for it. She was not. Standing at the forward observation window of the delegation ship, watching the ancient human vessel fill the view, she felt something she had not expected. Something close to awe. The ship was enormous, yes. But it was the way it looked that struck her. It looked like something that had lived. Every plate of its hull told a story. Repairs layered over repairs, some done in metals so dark they looked like old wounds. The carved geometric patterns she had noticed on the scans covered far more of the surface than she had realized. Whole sections of the ship wrapped in those precise, deep marks, as if the hull itself had been turned into a kind of language. The delegation tried hailing it the moment they dropped out of travel speed. They used 17 languages. They used the 3 reconstructed forms of Old English the conclave's linguists had pieced together from ancient archives. They sent mathematical sequences, light pulses, basic audio tones. For 6 hours, they received nothing. The delegation cabin was very quiet during those 6 hours. Then, without any warning, the communication channel opened and a voice came through. It was a human voice. There was no question about that. Velsath had studied old human audio archives enough to recognize the basic shape of the language, the rhythm of it, the way the sounds were formed. But this voice was not speaking an old language. It was speaking perfect galactic standard, the shared language of the conclave, a tongue that had been developed and refined over the last 10,000 years, long after humanity had fallen silent. She introduced herself as Commander Idris Voss, acting captain of the USCS Unbroken Meridian, commissioned in the year 3847 of the old human calendar. She spoke calmly, the way someone speaks when they have already decided how a conversation is going to go. She did not ask for help. She did not sound frightened. She sounded, Velsath thought, like someone who had not been frightened in a very long time. Velsath asked the first question, because no one else seemed to be able to find their voice. She asked what had happened. What followed was 2 hours of listening. Idris explained that the Meridian had been pulled into the Void Rift during what was supposed to be a standard patrol near the Orion Arm boundary. The rift had not destroyed the ship. Instead, it had pulled the vessel through into something else entirely. A region of space that existed outside the known galaxy, separated from it by a boundary that their instruments had no framework to describe. The best term the crew eventually settled on was a fold, a collapsed place, a dead section of a much older universe, slowly caving in on itself, where the normal rules of space and physics were close enough to familiar to survive in, but different in ways that took years to fully understand. They had tried to get back immediately. Of course they had. They spent the first decade attempting to recreate the conditions of the rift, to punch back through the boundary, to find any signal from the galaxy they had come from. None of it worked. The fold had its own gravity, its own radiation fields, its own strange tides that could tear a ship apart if you weren't careful. They lost 3 smaller vessels in those early attempts. After that, the captain at the time, not Idris, but her predecessor's predecessor, made the decision to stop fighting the fold and start learning it. That decision, Idris said, was what saved them. With nowhere to go and nothing but time, the crew of 4,200 turned their full attention to survival and science. They stripped down their technology and rebuilt it from the ground up, using the materials available in the fold and the strange physics of that dead space as both a laboratory and a resource. The fold's gravitational collapse became a power source. They learned to harness the energy released by a universe slowly dying, which turned out to be more power than they had ever imagined possible. Their hull materials were rebuilt over generations, using compounds that didn't exist in normal space, which was why the scans had looked so strange. Their engines were redesigned so many times, they barely resembled the originals. But the technology was not the hardest part. The hardest part was the things that lived in the fold. Idris paused when she got to this section, and for a moment the calm in her voice shifted into something else. Not fear exactly. Something older than fear. She described entities that existed in the dark between universes. Things that had no shape that human eyes could properly process. That communicated through means that had taken decades to even identify as communication. They were not hostile in the way that word usually meant. They did not attack. They did not threaten. They simply did things that the crew could not understand and could not predict. And in the fold's strange environment, those things were often deadly. 30 years of careful, painful study. 30 years of lost crew members and failed attempts and slow, grinding progress. Until the day they finally understood what the entities were doing well enough to respond. Until the day the communication became real. And after that, after the understanding was built, the entities stopped being a threat. They became something else. Velsath noticed that Idris did not say what that something else was, and she did not push. Some things she was beginning to understand, humans kept for themselves. The delegation ship was completely silent when Idris finished speaking. Velsath had a page full of questions. She chose the most obvious one. She asked, if they had solved the technology of the fold, if they had eventually found a way through the boundary and back into the galaxy, why had it taken 20,000 years to return? The silence on the line lasted long enough that Velsath thought the channel had closed. Then Idris answered. She said it had not taken 20,000 years. They had found their way back through the boundary 200 years ago. The technology to do it had actually been solved much earlier than that, but confirming it was stable and would not simply kill everyone on the ship had taken time. When they finally crossed back into the galaxy, 200 years ago, they had arrived at the edge of what had once been human space, and found it full of other people's ships, and other people's stations, and other people's flags. They had made a decision. They had gone dark. No signals, no contact. They had watched. They had listened. They had spent 200 years learning the shape of the galaxy they had come home to. Who held power? Who told the truth? Who had taken what? And who might be trusted? Velsath set down her notes slowly. She asked, "Then why come forward now?" Idris's answer was simple and quiet, and it settled over the delegation cabin like a cold wind. She said, "Because they had learned enough." The news of the Meridian's return did not travel slowly. By the time Velsath's delegation ship was heading back to the Conclave station, the story had already spread across every major communication network in the galaxy. Every species in the Conclave had their own reaction. Some were excited, the way people get excited by the discovery of something ancient and remarkable. Some were nervous, the way people get nervous when something they assumed was safely gone turns out not to be. And some, particularly the older and more powerful members of the Conclave, were quietly and urgently consulting with their military advisors. But the thing that truly shook the Conclave, the detail that turned nervous conversation into something closer to panic, was not the ship itself. It was the 200 years. 200 years of watching. 200 years of silence, while the crew of the Meridian had listened to every signal, monitored every ship movement, studied every political negotiation, and every quiet decision made in the halls of the Conclave. 200 years of learning, and the Conclave had not noticed a single moment of it. That fact sat in the chest of every delegate like a stone. If they had missed 200 years of human observation, what else had they missed? What had been seen? What had been recorded? The answer came 3 weeks later, when Idris Voss arrived at the Conclave station. She did not arrive via the fleet. She arrived on a single shuttle, accompanied by 6 crew members. They were all human, which was obvious, though not in the way the delegate historical files had prepared anyone for. The old images of humans showed a soft-looking species, medium-sized, not particularly physically impressive by galactic standards. The crew members who walked off that shuttle were something different. They moved carefully, the way people move when they are used to environments that require constant attention. Their eyes tracked everything in the room. They were quiet in a way that felt deliberate rather than polite. And they were all, without exception, completely calm. Idris herself was a woman of middle age by human appearance, though Velsath had done the math and knew that human age was a complicated subject for someone who had grown up in a fold. She had short gray hair and dark eyes that missed nothing. She wore a uniform that was clearly descended from old human military design, but had been so modified and rebuilt over generations that it looked like something entirely new. On her left sleeve, embroidered in a deep red thread, was a small flame, the only decoration she wore. She stood before the full conclave assembly, and she did not begin with greetings. She began with a file. The data package she transmitted to the conclave's central system took 11 minutes to fully load. When the delegates opened it, what they found was a record. A complete, detailed 200-year record of every action taken by every conclave member species in what had once been human territory. It was organized by species, by date, by type of action, and by the specific article of the old Galactic Accords that each action violated. The Galactic Accords were very old treaties. They had been signed between humanity and the other spacefaring species of the Conclave before the Void Rift, before the Silence, before the long years of human absence. They had never been formally dissolved. No one had ever officially declared humanity dead or legally absent. No one had ever held a proper session to decide what would happen to human territory and human claims under galactic law. Things had simply been absorbed. Gradually, quietly, over thousands of years, the absence had been treated as permission. The file made clear that it had never been permission. Colony worlds resettled without consent. Trade routes through human space reclassified under new ownership. Historical sites stripped of artifacts that were now sitting in private collections and museum vaults across the galaxy. And most striking of all, the hegemony of Vosk, one of the most powerful Conclave members, had built a full shipyard facility on top of the ruins of New Carthage, which had been humanity's first extrasolar colony, a place of deep historical significance to every human who had ever lived. The chamber was very quiet while the delegates read. She stood at the front of the room with her hands behind her back, and she waited with the patience of someone who had grown up in a place where patience was simply a survival skill. When enough time had passed, she spoke. She said the Meridian had not come to the Conclave looking for war. She said that plainly, and she meant it plainly. 20,000 years of nothing more and nothing less than what the Accords had guaranteed. And then she said the sentence that ended the silence in the chamber with an entirely different kind of silence. She said they had already begun. For a moment, no one understood what she meant. Then the alert signals started going off. Station after station, across the Conclave's deep space observation network, was registering new contacts. Not ships, structures. Stations, relay nodes, communication beacons, all appearing simultaneously across the regions of former human space. Each one was already fully operational. Each one was broadcasting on the old human emergency frequencies, updated with encryption that the Conclave's own analysts immediately identified as being decades beyond anything in their current systems. One of the Vosk delegates stood up and demanded to know how this was possible. How had these structures been built and placed without anyone seeing? Where had they come from? How many humans were out there? Idris looked at him for a moment. Then she smiled, a small, quiet smile, and she said that those were all very good questions, and that the Conclave was welcome to look into them. The session broke into noise and argument almost immediately. Species shouting across the chamber at each other, at Idris, at their own aides. It was the loudest the Conclave had been in centuries. Velsaf sat in her observer seat and watched Idris stand at the front of the room, completely still, completely calm, while the galaxy argued around her. And she thought, not for the first time, that 20,000 years in the dark had not broken these people. It had done something else entirely. The weeks after Idris Voss's appearance before the Conclave were the strangest in living memory for most of the galaxy's species. And living memory for some of those species stretched back a very long time. The Conclave's intelligence networks went into full operation. Every resource they had was pointed at the question that was keeping the delegates awake at night. How many humans were out there, and where were they? The structures that had appeared overnight in former human space were being studied, but they gave up very little. The materials they were made from were unfamiliar. The encryption on their broadcasts remained unbroken, and every attempt to approach them was met with the same response. A calm, automated message in galactic standard, stating that the structure was the property of humanity, and that any attempt to interfere with it would be logged and addressed through proper legal channels. Not a threat, just a statement of fact, which somehow felt worse than a threat. Velsoth was working 16-hour days. She had been assigned as the primary conclave contact for Idris and the Meridian crew, partly because she had been the first to make contact, and partly because she was, of all the conclave delegates and officials, the one who seemed most able to sit in the same room as the humans, without either panicking or posturing. She had developed something that could not quite be called friendship with Idris. The human was not the easiest person to get close to, but it was a real working relationship, built on mutual respect and a shared interest in facts over drama. It was Velsov who found the hidden communities. She had not been looking for them specifically. She had been going through old Deep Space Survey data, cross-referencing it against the records in the human file that Idris had brought to the conclave, trying to build a complete map of what had and hadn't been discovered in former human space. She was looking for patterns, and she found one that stopped her entirely. There were signals, old ones, very faint, buried in frequencies that the conclave's networks had always written off as background noise. They were not background noise. They were communications, compressed into narrow bands and designed to look like natural radiation signatures. Someone had built these signals to be invisible unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. It took Velsov 3 days of work to decode the first one. When she did, she sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time. There were humans living in deep space, not on the Meridian, not recent arrivals. Humans who had been there for thousands of years, living on hidden stations, on the dark sides of uninhabited moons, in hollow asteroids converted into city-sized habitats, in slow-moving ships running completely silent in the deep outer dark between star systems. Hundreds of communities, maybe more, scattered across a region of space that spanned half the galaxy, connected by those buried signal networks, living quiet and invisible and completely undiscovered. They had not disappeared when the silence fell. They had chosen the silence. Velsov brought the data to Idris that evening. She expected to surprise her. She did not. Idris listened to the full report, and then she nodded, slowly, and said, yes, she had known. They had made contact with the hidden communities within their first year of being back in the galaxy. They were the reason the structures had gone up overnight. Not just the Meridian's crew, but thousands of people in dozens of locations, all moving at once, all following a plan that had been communicated through those buried signal networks over the course of 200 years of quiet preparation. Velsov asked how this had been organized. Who had planned it? How communities separated by thousands of light years and thousands of years of time had managed to stay coordinated. Idris told her. When the Great Silence had begun, when it became clear that the conclave was moving into human space and that no help was coming, that humanity was effectively alone and exposed, the communities that had gone quiet had not simply hidden in panic. They had made a decision together. A coordinated, deliberate, species-wide decision, passed from generation to generation through oral tradition and encrypted archives. The decision was simple. Disappear completely, preserve everything, wait for the signal. They called themselves the Holders of the Ember. The name had been passed down through 20,000 years, spoken in whispers in hidden habitats, taught to every child born in the dark spaces between stars. The idea behind the name was equally simple. A civilization was like a fire. If you couldn't keep the fire burning openly, you kept an ember alive, small, hidden, protected from the wind, and waited for the conditions to change. The ember was everything. The art, the science, the history, the genetics, the language, the memory of what humanity had been and what it intended to be again. Every hidden community was a holder of that ember, and they had held it for 20,000 years. Velsov thought about that for a long time after Idris finished speaking. 20,000 years of living in the dark. 20,000 years of raising children who would never see open sky, who would grow up knowing they were hiding, who would spend their entire lives protecting something they might never get to use. She tried to imagine the weight of it. She couldn't. It was too large. She asked what the signal was, the one that had told the holders to come forward. Idris said it was the meridian itself, their return. When the ship crossed back into the galaxy 200 years ago and made contact with the nearest hidden community, the message that went out through the buried signal networks was short. It was one sentence, passed from community to community across the light years. The ship has come home. That was all it had taken. Every community had known, from the moment they received those words, that the waiting was over. The 200 years since then had been preparation. Quiet, careful, thorough preparation, for the day the meridian finally made itself known to the galaxy. That day had now come. Velsath asked if the Conclave's intelligence networks would eventually find all the hidden communities on their own. Idris said they would find some of them. Probably not all. There was no arrogance in the way she said it. Just a straightforward answer, in the same calm tone she used for everything. It was, Velsath thought, the most unsettling thing about her. Not what she said, but how little effort she seemed to need to say it. There was no performance in any of it, no desire to impress or frighten. Just a woman who had grown up in an impossible place, who had inherited an impossible responsibility, saying the true thing in the simplest way available. Back at the Conclave, the hawks were growing louder. The arguments for military action were being made more openly now, more urgently. Preemptive action, before the humans could consolidate. Remove the threat before it became a threat. The language was always careful. It was always framed as stability, as protecting the Conclave's existing order. But the meaning was plain enough. And then, one morning, every Conclave warship stationed near former human space woke up to find a message waiting for them on their internal command channels. Not on the public frequencies, not on the military broadcast networks, on the internal channels, the ones that were supposed to be the most secure communications in the Conclave fleet. The message was in the voice of Idris Voss. It said that every weapon system on every ship in range had already been mapped and logged. It said that every fleet position in the region had been recorded. It said that humanity had no interest in war, but that it was also no longer asking for anyone's permission to exist. The message ended there. In the chamber where the Hawks had been building their case for military action, the argument died very quietly and did not come back. 5 years is not a long time for a galaxy. Some of the species in the Conclave measured their history in millions of years. Some had governments older than humanity's entire time in space. 5 years was a blink, a moment, barely enough time for the paint to dry on a new treaty. And yet, 5 years after the unbroken meridian drifted back into the known galaxy, almost nothing looked the same. The holders of the Ember had come out of hiding in waves. Not all at once, that was never the plan. They emerged carefully, community by community, making themselves known to the Conclave through Idris and the Meridian's crew, establishing presence and legal claim before moving to the next step. It was slow by the standards of military action, but it was steady, and it could not be stopped or reversed, because each step was built on solid legal ground under the old galactic accords that no one had ever properly dissolved. The communities were extraordinary. Velsath had visited 3 of them in person, and each visit had left her needing several days of quiet afterwards just to process what she had seen. These were not broken people emerging from 20,000 years of survival. They were not traumatized refugees grateful for recognition. They were communities that had spent 20 millennia doing nothing but preserving, developing, and building in secret. Their medical science was far beyond anything in the Conclave standard systems. Their understanding of genetics, of long-term biological adaptation, of what it meant to keep a species healthy across thousands of generations in difficult environments. All of it was decades ahead of what anyone else was working with. Their art was unlike anything in the galaxy. 20,000 years of creating in the dark, with no audience outside their own communities, had produced music and writing and visual work that was deeply strange and deeply beautiful. The first human art exhibition opened on the Conclave Station in the 3rd year, and the line to get in stretched around the station 3 times. The pieces were borrowed from hidden community archives, scanned and displayed with the community's permission, and they told a story that no history book had been able to tell. What it actually felt like to be the last ones, holding the ember, waiting in the dark. The scientific work was perhaps the most immediately impactful. In the 2nd year, the Meridian's crew published their research from the fold, a full account of their findings in that collapsed space, including the physics they had developed and the material science they had perfected. They did not sell it. They did not trade it. They published it openly, available to every species and every researcher in the galaxy. Velsoth later asked Idris why they had given it away freely when it could have been used as enormous leverage. Idris said that knowledge locked behind a door helped no one. She said that 20,000 years of darkness had made humanity very clear on that point. The research rewrote 3 foundational pillars of the physics the Conclave scientists had been working from. It opened up entirely new fields of study. It was, by every measure, the most significant scientific contribution in recorded galactic history. And the fact that it came with no strings attached, no conditions, no cost, that did more for humanity's standing in the galaxy than any legal argument or military demonstration ever could have. Not everyone was happy. The Vosk hegemony spent most of the first 2 years in a state of formal protest. Their position was that the old galactic accords were too old to be enforceable, that 20,000 years of absence had effectively nullified any claim based on pre-Rift agreements. They made this argument loudly and repeatedly in every conclave session that would hear it. They commissioned legal scholars to write opinions supporting them. They lobbied every species that would listen. And then Idris requested a formal legal arbitration under the accords themselves. The arbitration took 8 months. The panel was made up of 3 conclave species with no direct stake in the outcome. They reviewed the original treaty texts, the record of the years following the rift, and the complete absence of any formal proceeding that had ever officially ended humanity's legal standing. The judgment was clear and simple. The accords were valid. Humanity's claims were valid. The hegemony's shipyard on New Carthage was built without legal authority on territory that had never ceased to belong to humanity under galactic law. The hegemony was given a choice: relocate voluntarily with full financial support from the conclave, or face a continuing legal process that the arbitration panel's own opinion suggested they would lose at every stage. They relocated, slowly and with a great deal of complaint, but they relocated. The first human settlement team arrived at New Carthage 6 months later. Velsoth watched the broadcast of their arrival on the station's common screens, a small group of people stepping out onto the surface of an old world, looking up at a sky their ancestors had stood under 20,000 years ago. She was not the only one in the room who was quiet for a long time afterward. The formal name for what humanity had become came together in the 4th year. The reconstituted human sovereignty. Idris said the name was too grand, but the communities had voted on it, and she had learned a long time ago that you did not argue with 20,000 years of people who had been waiting for the moment. It was given full conclave recognition in the 5th year, seated at the table with its own delegation and its own legal standing, the same as any other member species. By then, 14 core star systems had been formally reclaimed. Diplomatic relationships had been established with 6 species who existed outside the conclave's formal structure. Older civilizations, quieter ones, who had their own complicated history with the major powers, and who had watched humanity's return with interest and something that looked a great deal like quiet satisfaction. Velsoth spent the 5th year writing. She had been taking notes since the first day the sensor web picked up the meridian signal. And over time, those notes had grown into something larger. A full historical account of everything that had happened, from the first impossible reading on the screen to the formal seating of the human delegation at the conclave table. She called it The Silence and the Ember. The final chapter was the hardest to write. She spent 2 weeks on it, drafting and deleting, trying to find the right shape for the question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since the very beginning. She finally wrote it down, and let it stand as the end of the book. The question was this: had humanity's 20,000 years of silence been a defeat, or had it been the opening move of the longest and most patient game ever played in the history of the galaxy? She did not answer the question in the text. She felt it was not her answer to give. When the book was finished, she brought a copy to Idris. It had become a habit. Velsoth would bring things to Idris, ask what she thought, and usually receive an answer that was shorter and more useful than anything she had come up with herself. They were sitting in a small room on the conclave station, with tea that Idris had made from something she had brought from the Meridian, and Velsoth read the final chapter aloud. When she finished, she looked up. She asked Idris what she thought. Idris looked at her tea for a moment. Then she looked at Velsoth. There was something in her eyes that was hard to read. Something that held 20,000 years of history behind it, and the weight of every person who had carried the ember through the dark, and the long, long patience of a species that had decided, somewhere in the depth of an impossible void, that it was not done yet. She said nothing. She smiled, very slightly, and said nothing. Velsoth wrote in the margin of her final page, "She smiled and said nothing," which was, I think, really all the answer the galaxy needed.